Welcome to Season 2, Episode 1, Chronicles of UK Salafism and Insider Perspective. I will begin this season by recapping on the previous one, in which I discussed the development of the Salafi movement during the 90s. I also juxtaposed that with my own personal development and learning throughout that particular decade. And it's important to make a distinction between the 90s and the noughties for one simple reason. In the 90s, the Salafi movement was proactive and progressing and consolidating itself, unlike the noughties, in which it found itself, we as Salafis found ourselves on the back foot and under a global spotlight due to seismic events that took place across the world. And it's unfortunate that the undercurrent at that time, while facing those challenges, was such that fissures continued to occur, splitting, divisions, infighting, and almost cannibalistic tendency continued amongst the Salafis, a particular sect, an emerging sector that was at the forefront of that, and that further weakened, dissipated Salafis as a unit that was and continues to be the most effective in countering, in combating violent extremism and terrorism. All of that will be discussed as I go through this season and looking year by year at developments and challenges in the 2000s. But it's also apt that I begin this particular season and episode where I left off in 1999. And that was in regard to the deaths of two huge scholars, Shaykh Ibn Baz and Shaykh Al Albani. It's apt, as I said, to start at this point, and I want to read some excerpts of Shaykh Al Albani's last will and testament. And I'll begin that by what he'd written and has been translated into English. In the name of Allah, most merciful, bestower of mercy. The Shaykh said, I counsel my wife, my children, my friends, and all my loved ones, when news of my death reaches them, that they first supplicate to Allah to forgive me and have mercy on me, and that they do not wail over me nor cry with a raised voice. Secondly, I advise them to hasten my burial, and that they do not inform my close relatives or brothers of my death, except for the amount that is necessary to carry out the preparation of my burial. I ask that they put my neighbor and sincere friend, Izzat Khida, Abu Abdullah, in charge of washing my body, as well as whoever he chooses to assist him in that. Thirdly, I choose to be buried in the closet area of the graveyard, so that those who carry my body will not be forced to place me in a car, and which will consequently lead the followers of the janazah procession to drive in their cars. I also ask that my grave be put in an old graveyard, which will most likely not be dug up any time in the near future. And it is upon those who live in the land in which I die to not inform anyone outside of these lands, such as my children, not to mention other than them until I am buried. Not to mention to other than them until after I am buried. This is so that the emotions will not overwhelm and cause people to act on them, which will in turn result in the delay of my janazah, my funeral. He continues, I ask the guardian, Allah, that I meet him while having my past and future sins forgiven by him. I bequest my entire library, whether the book is printed, photocopied, in manuscript form, in my handwriting or someone else's, to the library of the Islamic University of Medina. This is because of the good memories I have of it with regard to dawah, to the Quran and Sunnah upon the methodology of the Salaf Saleh when I was a teacher there. I hope that Allah will cause it to be of benefit to the leaders of that university, just as the university students benefited from its owner in those days. And I ask Allah that He benefit me by them, the students, through their sincerity and in their dawah. Then he quotes a verse from the Quran, English rendition, Surah Al-Ahqaf, verse 15. Quote, O my Lord, make me thankful for your favor that you bestowed upon me and upon my parents, and make me one that does righteous deeds that you love, and correct my offspring for me. Surely I repent to you, and surely I am from amongst the Muslims. And it's written by Muhammad Nasruddin Al Albani on the 27th day of Jamad al Ula, 1410, according to the Hijri calendar. So again, I thought it was apt to begin with that, as a reminder of the magnitude of the Sheikh and his standing in the Muslim world. And he's still sorely missed today. And we have not seen the likes of him, Sheikh Ibn Baz, Sheikh Uthaymeen, Sheikh Muqbil, and other great scholars who passed away over the last 20 years or so. Now, turning attention to my personal religious development and the classes I was attending in 2000. And there was a continuation of Bulugh al-Maram, the fiqh jurisprudence class. And on the 15th of December 2000, I attended lesson 12. And we were looking at a particular hadith, hadith number 43, which was narrated by Al-Mughira bin Shu'bah. And this was about purification and the manner in which the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, performed ablution. And this Sahaba narrated that the Prophet performed ablution and passed wet hands on his forelock, over the turban, and 2 leather socks, close quote. And that was contained in the authentic canon Muslim. And then some information was given about Mughira and that he embraced Islam at the Battle of Khandaq, the trench. And the rest of the lesson was involving rulings derived from this particular narration and surrounding discussions on that. My notes for that particular lesson, and I'm going to pay particular attention to my handwritten notes for a reason which I will come to shortly, but I'd written 6 pages for that lesson. The next lesson was on the 22nd of February, lesson 13, in which we covered hadiths 47 up to 52. And I'd written 5 pages of notes there, which I have with me now. The following lesson was on the 11th of April, and that was lesson 14, chapter 5, wiping over the leather socks specifically, and we looked at hadiths from number 53 to 56. My handwritten notes on this occasion were 4 pages. On the 18th of April, we did lesson 15. That was 4.5 pages. 25th of April, lesson 16, which was chapter 6. And that was focusing on the nullification of wudu, our ablution. And that was 3.5 pages. Moving to August now, there was a gap between the Bulugh al-Maram classes, and I haven't got any information confirming why that was, but my next notes were on the 15th of August, 4.5 pages. And coming to that point that I mentioned, why I'm referring to my handwritten notes. For those that I've just described, it was 27 handwritten pages. And I'm highlighting this because the impact of embracing Salafiyah for some of the colleagues who had never studied before, even at a rudimentary level, was profound. Non-religious or non-academically focused individuals, brothers and sisters, were transformed by the structure of teaching and attending the classes and making notes. And I'd like to contrast that with what we see today. There's an edutainment culture where the attention span of younger Muslims, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation, is very short. And it's all snippets or memes of verses from the Quran, religious sayings, hadith. The YouTube videos are very short, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. There are lectures on there, and there's some very good and structured lectures on there, but the attention span today is not what it was 20 years or so ago overall. There are elements and there are catchments of young Muslims who are dedicated to studying, and you can see the difference in that studying. However, returning to my cohort, my colleagues at that time, the impact was a profound one. But at the same time, I don't want to lose focus on those who are not serious about study, but were elevated as speakers, as callers to Islam, because they went to Medina, dropped out of Medina University, were kicked out in some instances, and they had by and large learned some Arabic to varying degrees. I will come to that again shortly, and I did mention that in the previous season as well. But one of the reasons I'm sticking with this particular point is because those of us who had studied at school, those of us who were used to a structured way of learning, sitting and making notes and sitting at the feet of a scholar or senior student of knowledge, and by that I mean Sheikh Ahmed Zahir Awais, not some colleague who's been elevated by his peers, as we see many times today, but sitting at the feet of such an individual who studied from scholars like Sheikh Rabi', who studied from other senior scholars as a student when he spent his time in Saudi Arabia in the Islamic University of Medina, was a refreshing focus for us as Muslims of 10 years. And I actually went back and referred to my handwritten notes when I was a non-Muslim in secondary school, Roman Catholic secondary school, John Griffiths in Wimbledon. And I compared my writing quite recently to my handwritten notes in my secondary school days. And I've got notes here to show and confirm why this format of studying was so important. Leaving Catholicism and embracing Islam, there needed to be more, and there was, and continues to be a lot more in Islam. But when I looked at my notes from the 7th of May 1981 of my religious studies book, I see that the handwritten notes are talking about prayer and their significance as a Christian. On the 21st of September 1981, I have 3 pages written in which I'm writing about the sacraments in Catholicism. The 17th of February 1982, my notes were providing references for the parables, 15 in total. And that was 4 pages I wrote then as a 16-year-old. And then when I look on that same day, I've also listed different kinds of conflicts that were illustrated in the New Testament, Luke's Gospels in particular. And there were 10 areas of conflict that I highlighted. And that was 5 pages because I had to discuss each one of them. And even when I went further back and looked at my notes in religious education in my school on the 11th of September 1979, they're no different from what I was writing in 1980, 1981. And even on the 16th of October 1979, I've listed the 10 commandments, followed by the 8 beatitudes and a detailed discussion of those. That was as a young teenager. So I want the reader to understand, and I will say this specifically about us as converts, because I think that as converts, there is some castigation about our academia or how we've embraced Islam. And hopefully this would shed light that many converts did have elements of education with religiosity, be it Christianity, admittedly, but there was a structure that was there for many of us. So I said I was going to mention about students or so-called students who had gone abroad to Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, Islamic University of Medina, and then returned to heroes' welcome, having not even graduated from the universities. And this became problematic. And even some of us who were academically minded to varying degrees, we contributed to what was a denigration of any type of study in an academic format. So brothers and sisters were criticized and castigated for studying in universities. And unfortunately, the scholars endorsed that need to not study in the universities, bringing fatwa that it was free mixing and the like. Many of us believed in that at the time. from the 90s, I'd started looking differently at that because I saw a contradiction with certain scholars, them coming and studying in universities in Birmingham, sending their children to come and study elsewhere, yet they were telling us not to study in an environment where study was important to elevate ourselves beyond the communities or let's say the social margins that we were in. From the South Asian communities, it was a very negative thing to be embracing Salafia and opposing academic study. And that caused a lot of division amongst these traditional families. And as I said, many significant callers among the Salafi community at the time, including myself, initially, I go back into the 90s, not the noughties, were speaking against academic development and it was being frowned upon. And individuals with academia or even professional careers were being castigated by those who did not even finish a rudimentary level of primary, secondary school education, did not complete any other additional studies, and did not even complete religious studies. They may have had smatterings of Arabic, if that. And this was one of the problems that caused a negative impression on the Salafi movement. Now, I want to move on from that. I think it's necessary to move on from that because I've highlighted that before and I don't want to labour a point. And I will move quickly to some of the sermons that I was giving at the time. And there were 8 sermons delivered in 2000, of which I have my notes. There may have been more, but I'm only going to refer to the evidence I have in front of me. And on 7th of April, I delivered a sermon at Brixton entitled Purification and Cleanliness. And how appropriate that is when we look at the date of that particular sermon, again, the 7th of April 2000, and we look at 20 years later, the 10th of April 2020, and we are looking at an unprecedented trial that is affecting and damaging economies across the world and killing many individuals and infecting a multitude more with none other than the virus, COVID-19, the pandemic that we are currently facing now with more than 1/3 of the world's population on lockdown. And this particular sermon addressed a few aspects. And one of them was the social and moral decay of society. And I referred in this particular sermon to the story and the example of the people of Lot, the people of Lut. This is a Quranic story and it's also a biblical story. I'm not so sure about Judaism. I don't know much about that faith and the book, the Torah, except the Old Testament, of course. And I quoted a verse in Surah Al-Araf, the 7th chapter of the Quran, verse 82, the English rendition being, and the answer of his people, that's Lut's people, was only that they said, drive them out of your town. These are indeed men who want to be pure from sins. Close quote. I use that to reference the behavior of the society at that time, and we only have to compare it to the societies that we're seeing today, the liberal societies that we are witnessing today, and the behavior and the decadence and the like. I don't need to go into detail, and it doesn't even need to be Muslims who are highlighting this. I think non-Muslims can see what has happened with regards to the moral decay of the societies that we are living in which almost anything goes. I also focused on purification of belief, Tawheed, monotheism, and also purification of the heart. And before moving on to the next sermon, I just want to mention very quickly that we, the listeners who happen to be Muslim, and even those who are non-Muslim that may be listening, instead of focusing overly or too much on conspiracy theories and the political sparring that's taking place between parties and leaders, I think that during this pandemic, during this crisis, we would do well to focus on and reflect on things that we can influence, our own immediate circle of influence. Because whether there are accurate conspiracies or political machinations, there's very little we can do regarding those. But we can do something about ourselves and how we reflect inwardly and rectify particular aspects of our behavior. If it's our global footprint with regards to the amount of travel we were doing, if it's with regards to hygiene, because that's an issue as well, if it's regarding a number of facets that we could look at and improve. The amount of waste that we're doing, the amount of plastics that we're using, looking at the environment, we see that without all of this travel and without all of this industrialization being as active as it was before this pandemic, that we can do something within our own circles to make that little improvement. So I don't need to preach or lecture in that aspect, but I think it's something that needed to be said. So moving on with the rest of the sermons, so I don't make this particular episode too long. My second khutbah or sermon was on the 26th of May, and it was entitled, O Seekers of Knowledge, talking about the characteristic of those who seek knowledge and knowledge coupled with action. The third khutbah was the first of a four-part series in which I spoke on the 9th of June about death and its realities. The fourth was on the 16th of June, and that's about the hour, the day of judgment. The fifth khutbah or sermon was on the 30th of June, and that was about the hellfire and its description, followed by on the 21st of July 2000, my sixth khutbah, paradise and its description. And the seventh sermon was on the 18th of August, and that was about the fear of Allah. And I want to clarify for the non-Muslim listener at this particular stage that there are four aspects that the Muslims look at regarding our characteristics towards Allah, generally speaking, and fearing Allah is one of four, and I'll explain what that means very briefly. But we have hope in Allah, we love Allah, we have trust in Him, and we fear Him. We fear Him in regards to His punishment. And that's what it means regarding the fear of Allah. So the others are all alongside fearing Allah in that instance. We hope in His mercy as well. The final khutbah of that year, the eighth one, was on the 28th of December 2000, and that was entitled The Consequence of Evil Companionship. And as we draw to a conclusion, as was the format in the previous season, I'll mention a few global events that took place while we were engrossed in our development and events and activities on a microcosmic level amongst our communities. So the year 2000 was somewhat anticlimactic when we look at the anticipation that everyone had in 1999. But also, I would say it was the calm before the storm, because we are going to be looking at 2001 and the events that developed in that particular year. So on the 13th of January 2000, the Microsoft chairman, Bill Gates, still very prominent today, he stepped aside as CEO from his company. On the 14th of January, the UN tribunal sentenced 5 Bosnian Croats to up to 25 years each for the 1993 killing of over 100 Muslims in a Bosnian village. On the 31st of January, the family GP from the UK, Harold Shipman, was jailed for life for murdering 15 of his patients, making him the most prolific convicted serial killer in the UK. And on the 30th of March, another individual we have come to know well, Richard Branson, was knighted for his services to entrepreneurship. And it's really apt that this be brought now, because very recently we see that Richard Branson was trying to convince his staff to forego their salaries due to the current pandemic, despite the fact that he's a multimillionaire or even billionaire. Finally, on the 2nd of May, another appropriate reference and event, President Bill Clinton announced at that time, on that day, that the GPS would no longer be restricted to the US military. And the reason I wanted to end with that is because GPS was introduced more widely 20 years ago, and we know how the military used that and continue to use it, especially with regards to drone attacks on civilians. But now we're seeing the current conspiracy, crisis, suspicion around 5G. And I'll end on that note for us to reflect and compare 20 years ago to where we are today in 2020.